This is We the Sales Engineers Podcast, show 161.
Welcome to We the SEs Podcast, the show for sales engineers by sales engineers with your host, Ramsey Majaba.
What's up, SE family? Welcome back to another episode. I am your host, Ramsey Majaba, and with me is the amazing...
Beer?
Your name. Benny. I was waiting for you to say something.
Oh, I don't know if I'm deserving of that title per
It's
se.
well rehearsed.
All
right.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. How's it going today? How are you doing today there, Ramsey?
I am doing well. Thanks for asking. We have a great show. So today's guest is Tom Edwards, aka Thomas Edwards. He's the founder, I guess, of the... Do we found the blog?
I would say creator, founder, technically.
Okay. He's the founder of the Modern Solutions Consultant, the Modern SC, not SE. I heard him first on Chris White's Doctors Check-In on LinkedIn Live. So you might want to check out Chris White's LinkedIn Lives. He does amazing stuff there.
Absolutely. And it's always really cool, too, to see, I guess, the community around SEs and solution consultants and pre-sales architects and every other title under the sun that's really grown, I guess, around whether it be the various podcasts or different services available to them. Like I know that, you've held a whole bunch of different coffee chats with different SEs around North America, I think even around the world, the Dr. Check-ins as well with Chris, and there's all sorts of other ones that you'll see online. And I think it's really cool to see. And, speaking with someone like Tom, who's also created his own, I guess, footprint in the SE world was super insightful. And I think in the show, I don't know about you there, Ramsey, but I loved a lot of the things we talked about around kind of how he found himself in the SE role.
No, I didn't like that at all.
Yeah, no. Yeah, no, it's a really cool show, I think, to kind of like show somebody a progression of like getting from somewhere to somewhere else. And then obviously within the context of solution consulting.
Talking to him was great, and how he found it, like most of us, by accident, and he'll talk a little bit more about it. I just loved what he did with the role, right? And he didn't take the status quo. He tried to do different things, which we'll talk about on the show. So I don't know if anybody can hear that, but if you can, that's my children doing stuff upstairs. If you can't, never mind, edit that out of your head. How about we just jump into the show before this goes down a rabbit hole?
Let's do it.
Good evening, Tom. How are you doing?
All right. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. It's our afternoon. It's your evening. You sound not like me. You sound like someone from further east. Can you explain who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Sure. I am, well, I guess ultimately a pre-sales consultant, solutions consultant, working at an advisory firm, and I live in London, UK, okay. Hence the slightly different accent.
Oh, yeah. I can place it. And you're also known as a Modern SE. Or Modern SC, correct?
Modern SC, yeah. So the modernsc.com is my blog, all about the modern methods of pre-sales and enabling pre-sales.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to see a blog about that, because there aren't that many out there. So thanks for the efforts you put in. I saw you a little bit on Chris White's show. I told you that earlier, and I've been wanting to talk to you ever since. So thanks, Chris, for introducing me indirectly to Tom. So welcome to the show. You talk about enablement. So let's dig into that a little bit. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about your history and how you got to a point where you needed to start your own blog?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I kind of fell into pre-sales, I think much like lots of other people do, because it's one of those careers, isn't it, where you don't study at university for pre-sales. You don't sort of go on a graduate scheme or things like that, because it's one of those, it's a bit of an unknown career, isn't it? So people come at it from so many different professions. I actually started my career as an implementation consultant for SAP. And that is where I first saw pre-sales in action. And that's what made me think, right, this is what I want to do, because I guess I'm quite technically minded, but I've always loved problem solving and talking to clients. Being customer facing is really, really important to me. So it's that kind of opened my eyes into the pre-sales world. And then fast forward a few years, I was sort of a senior solutions consultant, getting more involved in the enablement side of things. And I've always been really passionate about reflective learning. So if you're coming out of a demo or a sales meeting, I've always found personally, writing down what went well, what didn't go well, what would you do again, what would you do differently, as a way to learn and continuously improve. And it was about 18 months ago, actually, one of my colleagues said, well, why don't you turn it into a blog? You've got all these learnings written down. Why don't you get it out there? Because I bet so many people would find it useful. And that's basically what I did. So it was actually the beginning of lockdown. Obviously stopped commuting. I stopped traveling, because before I'd be traveling to client sites all across Europe. I had so much extra time. So I thought, right, perhaps now is the time to do it, just to help sort of enable more junior solutions consultants in our world, but also talk about some of the enablement things that I've been doing in my organization. And that's where the Modern SC was born.
Okay. So going back, you were implementation consultant. That's post-sales, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So
absolutely.
you mentioned that you liked the business, you liked working with people. What did you see in the pre-sales people that you were working with that enticed you to want to move to that role?
It was the presentation skills, the getting asked difficult questions and having to think on your feet and come up with a solution. That all really, really appealed to me. It's something that's always appealed to me. Even when I was a kid, I used to play loads of music. I loved standing on a stage and performing, right? And I think a lot of pre-sales is a performance. When I was at university, I ran the student radio station. So it's something that I've always seen all the way through my life, sort of doing this, sort of presenting to an audience, or sort of being, I don't want to say being the center of attention, but you know what I mean, though. And when I was an implementation consultant, it didn't quite scratch that itch for me, which is what drove me towards pre-sales. So to answer your question, when I was seeing those people standing on a stage presenting during the sales cycle, I found that fascinating. I knew that's what I wanted to do.
It's funny, like pre-sales can scratch so many itches. Like, I came into it because, hey, I get to solve problem, help people. You like the presentation aspects of it, and it's so vast. I'm sure other people like other pieces of it. So it's a role that can scratch so many itches, and you're never going to get bored, because as soon as you're done, like, okay, I scratched the presentation itch, now I can focus on something else. So that's quite interesting.
I want to quickly ask, just if you don't mind me just quickly jumping in, when you first saw those people up on the stage, maybe as an implementation consultant, did you know what you were looking at, or like, did you know what that role was when you saw these people in the sales cycle, like doing all these amazing things that you'd want to be doing? Did you have a concept as to what they were at the time?
At the start, no, not at all. And especially because pre-sales, it gets called so many different things. So it's not even something you can easily Google. Sometimes if you say pre-sales to people, they think of business development, like picking up the phone and cold calling. But then equally, it gets called sales engineer or solutions consultant or sales consultant. So I think it can be, especially going back a few years, it's something that was very difficult to find much information about as well. I think now the world's changing with great podcasts like this and the other resources that we've got out there. The word is spreading. People are more aware of it as a profession, but back then, no, I knew so little about it.
That makes sense. Yeah. And the reason I ask is because I think I probably had a similar, or I shouldn't say I had a similar experience, but maybe somewhat, where like being exposed to the corporate world, I went into the corporate world as a business analyst first while still in school. And I got to work very close to sales engineers, but never actually worked directly with them. And so the whole idea, or the whole concept of a role to be able to help people, but to be able to give presentations, and I totally get what you're saying about being the center of attention to a degree. Like, that's not the purpose, but like, you are, the spotlight is on you to be able to provide value, and that's kind of a cool thing. Yeah, never had a concept of that, but then all of a sudden, yeah, you find yourself in that type of role, or maybe carve yourself into that type of role. And yeah, goodness, I've been blessed personally by all the resources that have been made available over the last couple of years as well, because yeah, it was completely non-existent before that, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that was a bit of a challenge was when I was seeing these people doing pre-sales, you know, because I was in the SAP world at that point. SAP is this enormous, enormous ERP. If you want to implement it, for some customers, that might take 6 or 7 years. Like, it is huge. So to be able to sort of architect that kind of solution, these pre-sales guys were the kinds of people who'd been in the industry for 20 years. They'd had such a wealth of knowledge and background in it that they could architect the pain points for the client to this absolutely enormous solution. I knew that that's not something that I could do because I was very, very early in my career. So actually, that's what pointed me towards a much smaller solution where it could be implemented still to enterprise clients, but implemented in 6 months, and a sales cycle was only 9 months or 12 months or something like that. So a lot smaller, a lot simpler, but more accessible to get into the pre-sales world.
Yeah. Sorry, this is within the context of SAP, or did you find a different company that you kind of fit that role for?
It was a different company. So I worked with a company called Trintech for just over 4 years after that. And it was a product which kind of plugs into an ERP. So it's still related and you're talking to the same stakeholders. So I was building on all of the skills that I already had, but different product, smaller product, same stakeholders.
Really cool. I don't know, Ramsey, if you ever heard of that before. I think that's really smart. The idea of like seeing a role that you want to have, but knowing that the company that you're a part of right now, like you might need a little bit more experience than you currently have to get that role there. And so you find somewhere else entirely to kind of find that role elsewhere to kind of maybe grow into it and maybe become eligible for that down the line. That's really cool. I don't know if I've heard of that before. That's awesome.
Well, I kind of did something similar, except I didn't know that was the role I was applying to. I worked for Nokia, Alcatel-Lucent, and there was no, if I were to become an SE, I would have to travel a lot, and I was traveled out. It's not something I wanted to do. And then I applied for a system engineering role, which turned out to be a sales engineering role for a vendor. So it worked out for me. I think a lot of people end up doing that, where if there isn't an SE path in their company, they might go to a vendor, which is the easiest path because they already know the product, they can use the product. At least that's what I've seen. In terms of reflective learning, I want to touch on that a little bit. Can you dig in a little bit deeper on like how it works? What do you do after you write everything down? All your thoughts?
So I think a huge part of reflective learning is really just that first step. It is writing it down and consciously thinking about, okay, what would I do again from a meeting? What would I do differently? What would I do more of? Thinking about it and writing it down, I think, is such a powerful thing. Step 2, though, is even more powerful. When you look back at these things, perhaps a month later, and say, right, I made a conscious effort to write that down. Have I changed? Am I making these same mistakes, or am I improving? And for me, obviously, people learn in very different ways. People improve in very different ways, obviously. But for me personally, all the way throughout my career, that's something I've found that's been so important to me, because it means you're conscious of what you need to improve on. And you can even turn these into goals. If you think, you know, I've made the same mistakes sort of in 3 different demos or 3 meetings, how can I set myself a goal so I can ensure that I am moving away from that and I am elevating my game, you know, for continuous improvement?
Yeah, so that's kind of touches on the question I want to ask next, which is, you're used to doing something one way, right? You're used to interrupting the customer, right? I say with SEs that they do it all the time, and we talk about it all the time. How do you change that behavior? How do you get them to change that behavior, or how do you change that behavior in yourself?
Well, I think going back to what I said, it's just being conscious of it. Because I think it's very easy for a lot of people to just not really think about what they're doing and just keep doing what they know. Whereas if you're continuously challenging your way of doing things, you're continuously thinking about, you know. So let's say your example is if you're conscious that you are interrupting your clients or your prospects, I think that in itself will make you more aware of it and less likely to interrupt them in the future. The other side, of course, I'm sure we'll go on to this, is all the feedback that you can get. So feedback from your sales exec who you've been in a meeting with, feedback from your other pre-sales consultants as well.
I think the big thing that you just mentioned is that you are aware, like as a person, like feedback is great, but if you're not aware and you don't believe or you don't want to change, it will not change. I think there's being aware and then wanting to change. So like, yeah, being susceptible to or open to feedback, I guess that's the next thing that you need to do when you're talking to account managers, I guess.
Well, the other thing that I really like to do with more junior solutions consultants who I'm mentoring and coaching is if they ask me for feedback, I'll throw it right back at them. What do you think went well? What do you think you could improve on? Because I think sometimes if you're giving feedback to somebody, they might take it on board, they might not. Whereas if they actively have to think about what went well and what didn't, I think that's more likely to stick. And then, of course, if you're the person who's giving the feedback, you can then add on to that with anything that you think they've missed or anything else that they would benefit from too.
It's so funny. Like, when I played basketball in Lebanon, and the best coaches that I had didn't tell me what mistakes I did. They kind of asked me, "What mistakes did you make there?" It's pretty much what you're saying. So it happens also in sports, which is why I think sales engineering is a sport. On my end, Benny, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I guess it's one other little thing. It probably is implied by the whole idea of just being conscious about what it is that you want to change, or be conscious about the behavior that you want to change, I guess, and be conscious of the fact that you want to change it. Also, what comes along with that, I'd imagine, would also have to be some sort of an action plan, whether conscious or unconscious, where if you have your goal, like let's say, for example, the interrupting customer piece, I would say without the action plan, if you're just conscious of it, I could see that potentially tripping somebody up, where like if you're all of a sudden very hyper aware of the fact that you're doing this thing that isn't really good, and you have no way to get out of that, like, okay, I know I'm doing this and this is really bad that I'm doing this, and I'm very aware of that, how to get out of that, that could kind of maybe cause some issues on a call. Whereas if somebody is conscious of it, but then has like a little action plan with respect to, okay, I recognize this is happening, what am I now going to do to maybe avoid that from happening again, or how am I going to not interrupt them the next time this comes up, some sort of like trigger that allows them to, I guess, like go, I don't know what the right word is, but like enact some sort of a plan in order to get to that goal, whoever that is. That's probably the one little thing that I would add to that, but that might already be implied by the fact that if you have a goal, figure out a way to actually get there. Just want to add that in.
No, Binny, I think that is such a good point, because you're absolutely right. If suddenly you're conscious of a mistake that you're making, then suddenly you realize you're making the mistake, and that puts the fear in you. You get nervous. That could suddenly affect your presentation or your conversation with a customer. So I think what you've said there is such an important reminder that we've got to have an action plan on how to achieve these goals, don't we?
It also goes. Sorry, go ahead, Benny.
I was going to quickly say, like, it doesn't even have to be like a super crazy elaborate plan either. I think like the hardest part, the biggest step for sure, is the whole awareness part, and like increasing one's consciousness to these things they want to change. And then we actually had a great little newsletter that went out this past week. Great, I'm biased, I wrote it, but regardless, it talks about that. Hey, actually, you being from the UK, talks about the British cycling team from those years, I think from the 2004 Olympics, or perhaps a little after that or before that, where they, and there was a great article in the Harvard Business Review about it, where I guess apparently the cycling team was notoriously bad for a number of years. They brought in a new coach that essentially like didn't want to change the game necessarily, but just came up with a whole bunch of very small 1% incremental improvements for the team. And eventually all these little changes ended up kind of, I guess, snowballing into them eventually winning the gold and doing really well and all that. And so just like being aware is the one thing, and then just making small little changes, small little tweaks here and there to eventually get there will eventually get you there. And those 1% improvements every day eventually amount to something pretty significant down the line. So that's all.
You're spot on. I think being a Brit, that's a story that a lot of us know about. And one of those tiny changes they made was they knew that getting a good night's sleep before an event for the cycling team was so important. And they didn't care about costs. They wanted to win. So for each of the cyclists, they shipped the actual mattress from each cyclist to the cycling events so they could sleep in their own bed the night before their races, because it's just that 1%, isn't it? If you can get a good night's sleep versus a bad night's sleep, that could be the difference between coming first or coming fourth.
They also painted the insides of their trailers white so they can see if there's dust. They did. There was a lot of 1%, but they accumulated to being like something insane. But talking about the plan that you were mentioning, Benny, it also works for not necessarily like realizing your behaviors, but it works for preparing in a demo. If someone says this, how am I going to react? Like if someone asks me a question I don't know, am I going to panic? I'm going to start sweating, or I'm going to say, oh, I haven't thought of that. I'll come back to you later. Or if during the demo, the software crashes, which never happens, how are you going to react then? So I like the idea of having a goal and also having a plan to deal with stuff that goes wrong at the same time.
And also maybe one last thing to also add. So I'm really good at writing things down. Actually, I shouldn't even say that. I've been trying to get really better. I've been trying to get better at writing things down. But I'm notoriously bad at a number of things, one of which, though, is ever looking back at what I ever wrote down that one time. And so I remember the last company I was working at, I think I went through about 3 different notebooks over the course of me being there. Let's just say there for about 3 years. And I eventually, like by the end of my time there, went back to my first couple of books just to see what I wrote down those, I guess, whenever I was first writing things. And it's crazy, all the interesting questions and like notes I'd have for myself around like, what is this? Learn that, figure out this thing, like circles with question marks around certain words that I never actually followed up on because I was really bad on. And these are just for my own understandings of things. But then by the time I'm actually reading these things a couple of years down the line, like all these things are just second nature to me. Like I could answer all those questions, like all those things I was wondering about back then. I knew just having been there for so long. And I think just being able to see that progression between where I was at a certain point in time to where I was at that moment, that alone too just kind of gives somebody, or gives one, at least me anyways, gave me a pretty decent confidence boost or a sense of my growth within a place. Because even though I didn't necessarily set the goal to actually, or rather I didn't set an action plan for me to eventually get to the level of understanding that I got to, I did somehow still get there. And it was just really cool to be able to kind of look back at that and appreciate that. So yeah, definitely just write down everything you want to be able to achieve. And it's kind of cool when you eventually get there to be able to look back at those down the line. Just want to add that little anecdote in there.
Yeah, and I love that too, because it's so easy to think, oh, I'm a bit stuck here, or I'm not progressing, and to be able to look back at that and see what were my questions, what were my thoughts 2 or 3 years ago, and you can see that progression. Absolutely, I can see what a huge confidence booster that must be.
Totally, yeah, it's pretty sweet.
So I want to talk a little bit about enablement specifically. When I think about enablement, the companies that I've been in, they've always been sales enablement, marketing slides, some training material. What is your definition of enablement specifically for SEs? Or at least how do you view it? Not necessarily a definition.
Well, enablement for SEs, SCs, pre-sales, I think that can be very different from sales enablement, because of course you've got the soft skills, you've got the messaging, but for me, I think it's something that needs to be tied to your go-to-market strategy. So if a new product or a new feature is being released, your SE enablement has to very much be part of that. So pre-sales are getting early access, early training, writing demo scripts or use case scenarios based on often the reason why that bit of the product has been designed. So often a lot of that is coming from your product management team, but translating it into the pre-sales world, what's the best way to demonstrate the value of this new feature? But then I think the other side of that, so that's sort of in line with your product cycles.
Yeah.
The other side of it is pre-sales process. And I think in some organizations that might be managed by sales operations, but in other organizations that will be managed by pre-sales enablement. So that might be sort of defining where pre-sales are involved within the sales process, your stages, for example, but also things like how do we automate demos, or how do we get better reporting and analytics and things like that. So I actually progressed from a solutions consultant into specializing in solutions consulting enablement, and that's basically how I split my time between the actual process of new features being released versus the actual process of pre-sales. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I've worked with sales enablement, and most of them have never been SEs. So it's great to see someone who was or is an SE or SC become that. What did you see lacking, or what did you think the first thing that you needed to do to help your SEs was?
It's funny actually, because when I joined my previous company, it was a very small company. It was about 200 employees, 250 employees, but it was growing very quickly. So when you've got a company that size, you don't really need necessarily pre-sales enablement, because you've got such a small number of pre-sales. You can just call up each other and get little tips, little hints, little best practices, and it might be a little bit chaotic, but just small enough to be agile. But I think as the company grew, we found that we needed a role for pre-sales enablement. So I think that's very much the case for sort of small growing companies. The question is, when do you need to put that kind of role in place? For much, much bigger companies, they will have whole teams of pre-sales enablement. For me, though, the number one priority that I had sort of starting to focus on those kind of things was reporting. And I think this comes back to your point, Vinny, when you were looking over things that you'd improved on over the years, it just gives you that insight into how you've grown and that confidence that it gives you. And I think that really translates into like a pre-sales process world as well. When I started my last company, we had no idea how many demos we were doing in a year. We didn't know how many demos it took to win a deal. We didn't know if it really made a difference going on site or doing it remotely. So that was my first ambition, was to just get people logging in our CRM. What demos are being performed? Are they on site, off site? How many demos are being performed for each opportunity? And suddenly that just gave us so much visibility around how did pre-sales actually work. But also with those analytics, you can use that to build business cases for new headcounts or putting in new processes or new software that's going to help your team be more effective and more efficient, because you can back it up with the data rather than just backing it up with a gut feeling.
So how did you convince the SCs to actually input that information? My manager struggled quite a bit getting that done. So how were you able to do that, to get all that information?
Do you know what? I thought we would get quite a lot of resistance. Actually, I think we're just lucky with the guys who are working in the organization. Everyone was very keen to do it because they saw the value of it. And I've been warned by a couple of people, you don't want it to turn into sort of an Orwellian story, 1984, where people feel like they're being tracked and they're being monitored and they're being watched. You don't want that. So by being able to say, well, look, we need these analytics to help put together a business case to have more people in pre-sales, which takes the burden off everyone if we're overworked to improve people's work-life balance and these things. So I think making any kind of change in an organization, you've really got to be very communicative of the benefits to reduce that resistance to change. And actually, yeah, we didn't have that much resistance at all. Everyone was very for it because they could see the benefits that would come out at the other end.
It's funny, and hopefully people will learn something from what you just said, because in our company, in my previous company, what they try to do is, instead of explaining the benefits for us, they tried to incentivize us. The more people input information into the CRM, they win like a dinner for themselves and their wives, for example. What happened was they connected Salesforce to their email, and now every email goes to the CRM. So CRM is full of information that means nothing to nobody. So I like that you actually sold it. You showed the benefit to them versus just simply trying to incentivize. Maybe it could be a combination of both, but at least they have to understand why you're doing it, so
Yeah,
that they can actually know what's important and what's not important. Because that's the big question we had. What information do you want in there? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you've just hit the nail on the head. That's called Goodhart's law. I think he was an advisor to the Bank of England in the 1970s, and Goodhart basically said, if you turn a measure into a target, it'll have dire unintended consequences, and it basically makes that measure unusable.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's exactly what you said in that example. The measure was how much are people putting into the CRM, right? That measures, because people are only going to be putting useful stuff in until you turn it into a target, and then people will put in as much as they can, and now that measure of how much actually went into the CRM is pointless. One of the examples that he uses is if you have a nail making factory, you might measure how many nails are being produced each month or each year. But if you put a target on make 1 million nails, the factory might go away and make the tiniest possible nails so they can make as many as possible. Or if you put a target on make 3 tons of nails, they might just make 3 1-ton nails to meet that target. So it ends up having such unintended consequences. So I think by being able to communicate the benefits, it shows goal congruence across an organization. So people at the bottom are fighting for the same goal as the people at the top because they understand what that benefit is. And I think that's such an important thing. I think any kind of organizational change, you've got to almost treat it like a sales cycle. You've got to communicate the benefit, get people really invested and signed up. Otherwise, that change isn't going to happen.
Yeah, sorry, Ben, just the biggest excuse that I hate is, well, that's what my boss wants. When a manager looks at me and says, well, the boss came up with these rules and now you're part of this other team. Like, what? But why? Why did they come up with these rules? Explain to me that. And then we can have a conversation. But just having an arbitrary, oh, because I said so. Like me telling my child, because I said so. You can't have chocolate because I said so. Sorry, Benny, go ahead.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I just want to really just reiterate what you guys are saying. Like the whole idea about getting buy-in from everybody, as opposed to just kind of incentivizing those really at the top to kind of get to that goal. It's just a way better way to go about it, because like in that example you gave there, Ramsey, with the whole CRM input piece, like I can imagine that, let's say a whole bunch of people get off to a really good start, then all of a sudden there's like 3 people who are just leading the pack of this Salesforce inputting data piece. So like 3 people are kind of gutting for that dinner, but then like 90% of the rest of the organization isn't even in the running anymore. So why should I input stuff into Salesforce? Because there's no incentive for them anymore. So like getting buy-in from every individual with their own, I guess, relative goals for things. So like I want to be working for a company that's going to be successful, or I want to work as part of a team that's able to do more for my organization. So I'm going to do as much as I can to enable our team to be better. If that means inputting stuff into Salesforce so that our team could be better, so that I could then reach my goals, then that's what I'm going to do. And it also harkens me back to a time, the first corporate company I ever worked for was a human resource management company. And one of the big things that they pushed that stuck with me, and it's such a good thing, I've seen in other organizations too, just have individual goals be tied to those organizational goals, so that whenever the organization, as they're kind of pushing to do certain things, every individual isn't necessarily fighting to like reach those same like high level organizational goals, but rather they're all trying to hit their own individual goals and like with their own individual desires that ultimately contribute to that larger organizational goal. So I love that whole idea about kind of driving for the real reason why somebody wants to do something and incentivizing them that way, as opposed to just like dangling a carrot in front of them and hope for the best.
Yeah, spot on. You made such a good point there, where if people see just 2 or 3 people gunning for the win, it can actually de-incentivize everyone. In one of my previous companies, we had an initiative for well-being and being healthy. So they set up a competition for who can do the most steps in a month. Okay, so like with tracking your steps on your phone. And in our company, we had a few people who ran marathons and ran triathlons. So you'd look at the leaderboard, and you'd see people doing sort of 100,000 steps in a day, or ridiculous things like that. And it made me think, well, I'm not even going to stand up, because what's the point? I'm never going to beat that. So you're absolutely right.
Very true.
And going back to my example, like where they were just sending every email to the CRM, they're going to win the dinner. And I could have done the exact same thing. I just, in my mind, I didn't understand why I am doing this. So the whole competition, the whole, like, again, like Tom, I stopped putting any information in, because too much information is the same as no information, at least in some cases. Yeah. So it could, I prefer systems over goals and targets, right? Create a system for me. Like, you want me to do 5 demos, create a system for me that would enable me to do 5 demos that are useful and will help customers, versus just telling me do 5 demos. And I call up my friends like, hey man, I need to do 5 demos. And, I know you don't care about this product, but can I show it to you?
Or like drive the reason as to why 5 demos is such an amazing, or such an important target to hit, and like, I guess, relate that to what's important to you. Or like, if you, I don't know what that would be, but I would imagine that would probably be the thing that would be the most effective. Where like, if you're incentivized just naturally to get 5 demos because of your own reasons for doing so, as opposed to like having somebody else tell you to do it, that would be ideal.
Yeah, I guess we can talk, like, that's something that we can talk about for days, and coming up with the perfect system for enabling or incentivizing sales engineers. Unfortunately, we have like 20 minutes left, and I wanted to talk about, you mentioned automating some tasks. What do you look to automate as for the sales engineering team, generally speaking?
Well, actually, this came out of measuring what demos we were doing. Just continuing that story. And what we were able to see is, with a lot of our opportunities, we'd win some, we'd lose some, but the third bucket were opportunities that just exited the sales cycle. And every company has these issues where your prospects don't have the budget, or perhaps it was underqualified and things like that. We were able to look at how many demos did we perform in the last 12 months that were linked to opportunities that exited the sales cycle, perhaps because they were underqualified. And it turned out that the answer was 50%. 50% of our demos were spent on opportunities which never got to the final stage. And that really showed me that we needed to change something very, very drastically, because the way that I saw that was, that's effectively 50% wasting pre-sales time, right? Yep. If you could absolutely eradicate those wasted demos, then it's almost like doubling the size of your team, because you've got twice as much time to actually focus on the opportunities that are properly qualified. So that is why I went looking at automating demos, to answer your question, Ramsey. And we looked at a few different solutions, but our idea was to implement something that we called, this is actually from the vendor, we use a company called Consensus.
Sponsors of this show.
Sponsor this show, fantastic. this isn't staged though. But they have this brilliant concept of what they call a demo qualified lead. So the idea is, your sales rep might have a discovery call with a client or with a prospect, and then they send them a very, very high level video demonstration. And that's going to be tailored to the client. They get to answer a few questions, and it basically gives them this interactive demonstration that's based on how they've answered a short survey. So they get a base level of understanding of what your product does and how it might solve their needs. Now, naturally, at that point, some clients will say, now I understand it, but we're going to have to go and find budget for that. And then perhaps that opportunity goes back to a lead. So the idea is to qualify your opportunities that are real, where people will watch a demonstration, where all of the stakeholders will watch a demonstration, they're properly invested in the sales cycle, and then say, yes, I want to move forward. And the way that we did this, the way that we tracked this, was basically to get a live demo from a pre-sales consultant, you had to have sent out one of these automated demos first, and it had to have been watched by all the stakeholders. And that's how we knew that not only was the sales rep saying it was qualified and it met our qualification criteria, but also they were properly invested in that. And then when we came to demo, we could add a lot more value, and we knew they were serious, and there was much less chance of it becoming a wasted demonstration.
Yeah, that's a big thing. If they don't watch the video right then and there, you already know that your demo is kind of a waste of time for both you and them. And sometimes account managers really just want to do a demo. There is no reason behind it, just in case in the future they might want something like that. So having a pre-recorded demo that would be very beneficial. I like that. Is there any other aspects of sales engineering that you think we can automate?
I think there's all kinds of stuff out there, not stuff that I specifically have a lot of experience in, but we started looking at Rfp automation, which I know that part of the market is really starting to explode. I've heard lots of other pre-sales organizations using that kind of technology to help speed up the RFP process, because that RFPs are the bane of pre-sales consultants' lives. I know some companies have RFP teams who are specifically geared up to do it, but in a lot of situations, it's the pre-sales guys who are, running the proposals and answering these RFP questions. So I think that has a lot of potential to be automated in the future for sure.
Yeah, like I'm seriously looking at my job and trying to figure out how I can automate a bunch of the work that I do so I can clear my time to actually do the more revenue generating hours. Except as an individual SE, it's very difficult. It kind of has to come from a leadership perspective. Now, I can automate a bunch of stuff, but if the leadership is not going to pay for it, that might be a problem. The easiest thing is automating scheduling meetings, really. You haven't, like, for example, my company does not allow me to install Calendly on my Outlook. So again, we come to the situation. So hopefully managers who are listening to this can help their SEs. If you don't want to pay for stuff, just enable them to actually go and automate in whichever way they see fit.
And the big thing there is, like, from a leadership perspective, pre-sales and solutions consultants, they're expensive because these are often people who are highly qualified and they have to know the product inside out. They've got to know the value and the benefits that product brings. These are highly skilled people. So the more that we can automate means the more value that solutions consultants can deliver. I was talking to someone the other day where they were talking about, just do a standard demo. And I honestly think for organizations where solutions consultants are just performing a standard demo, reading off a script, surely we can add more value than that. That is the perfect example of what can be automated.
Send a video.
Send them a video, send them an automated demo, because also the other benefit is then when we come to perform a demo, they've already got a baseline level of understanding of the product. They've already come to that meeting armed with questions. I want to find out more about this little bit of your product, or I don't think this bit is so relevant. So you can have a much more informed discussion. Actually, what we did after implementing demo video automation, we would actually do a second discovery call after they'd watched that video, because then we can really dig in even further without them getting frustrated because they still haven't seen the product. I always found this: if you try and do too much discovery, your prospects get frustrated. They just say, I just want to see it. I just want to see it in action. So if you give them that little snippet up front, you can actually get a lot deeper with your discovery. And then when you do come on to do a live demo, you can go a lot more in depth and make it so much more tailored because you really, really understand their business requirements, which I think is so important. So it allows us to add more value and to add value more efficiently.
I like that. I don't think this has ever been said on the show that a small demo, whether it's automated or a video, can enable further discovery. And I think that's a very good point that you just brought up here that I'm going to be pondering for a little bit of time. Thank you for that. Now I'm going to have a headache from thinking about it. I think, go ahead, Benny.
I'll just mention, like, yeah, the whole idea, but I think like recorded demos or the pre-recorded demo, even if at a very high level, I think would just pay for itself in time. Because I do also wonder, like, that same point that you mentioned there, Tom, about 50% of demos that were being given were to essentially unqualified leads. And there's so many people out there just kicking tires, which is kind of just an expression for kind of going around, like looking around for software, but not necessarily being super serious to buy at the time. And like you said, sales engineering or pre-sales resources are super expensive. So if our time is spent more valuably for the deals that are more engaged, and we're giving all those that are just wanting to kind of get a look around or who are just kicking tires, we send them that demo, then yeah, our time is being spent more valuably. And on top of that, I think one of my favorite things about Consensus is the whole idea of knowing who it's being shared and viewed by, because you might even get new stakeholders that you weren't even aware of in the past starting to see your demo. And that might start to, depending on the nature of your offering, might start to even just introduce other questions or other people that you kind of start a whole new opportunity within that same organization, even if it doesn't amount to anything in the short term. So yeah, all for the whole pre-recorded demos, I think.
And what you said about that stakeholder mapping, I think that's so important because it works going up the organization and going down the organization too. So when I've used it, when we were demonstrating some software into a shared service center, they sent it around all the individual users. So I got these 32 notifications for all of these additional people who'd watched the demonstration. And you get all of these great analytics that says, what part of the video were they most interested in? Which bit did they re-watch? What bit did they say, this actually isn't so relevant to me? And when you come to that live demo, you know that, right, these people in the room that we didn't even know were on our stakeholder map, this is what's important to them. And this is what's important to this group of stakeholders. But equally, it works the other way. Because I think when you're performing a demo, to get a very senior executive in a room for 2 hours or even just 1 hour can be really, really challenging. Whereas if you can send them a 15 or 20-minute recorded demo that's tailored to them, they're more likely to watch that. They're more likely to get exposure to your solution, and you're going to get the analytics of that senior stakeholder watching. And then you actually know that they are properly engaged, which helps you qualify that opportunity even further. So I think it works in both ways, and they're both really positive.
I think so. Go ahead, Ramsey.
I was just like, generally speaking, I've had Garen Hess on the show. We've had John Cook on the show. Like, Garen Hess is the CEO of Consensus. John Cook is the director of marketing. And we didn't talk about Consensus as much as we were doing right now, which is great because like you're a third party user. You're not affiliated with them. So I'm happy to hear your perspective on that. And they're paying me so like to sponsor the show. So it's not good if like hearing from a third party user is amazing. And the fact that we can always send a YouTube video to the customer, hey, watch this, and then we'll never know if they watched it, we'll never know when or where. So just having that analytics, and basically you're having customer intelligence legally, right? So you can figure out how to show them what questions to ask, what was interesting for them. So that's a great part of doing that, I guess.
Yeah, and VPs too, like that, what you're mentioning about like being able to know, well, first off, the fact that their time is so valuable, it may not be able to make it there for the call, but also like, I hope like VPs listening to this, don't take this the wrong way. You obviously have worked hard, and I'd imagine there's a little bit of an ego that goes along with that. Like when you get to a certain point in your career, your time is valuable, the impact of what you do is quite large as well. And so if you all of a sudden jump on a call, even if that call is with 30 other people and you're a VP and you're the organization trying to buy something from a vendor, if you have the sales engineer on the other side almost call you out by name or call you out by position or whatever it is to say that, hey, John, I know that you had a question or you were really interested about like XYZ. This is exactly how we address that. As a VP, I'm not a VP, but rather when delivering presentations and demos to VPs, I found it extremely effective just for them. They're there for a short period of time. They've probably been multitasking during that call, calling out exactly what it is that that they're interested in. And addressing that right then and there, and probably somehow within the natural flow of the conversation is such an effective thing because they immediately perk up. What you're talking about is immediately relevant to what they're interested in, and from their perspective, it's almost like, wow, like this person really was listening and cares about what I'm thinking about and care about. And as a VP, that's going to have quite a bit of pull across the rest of the organization's decision making. So yeah, I love everything about that. And yeah, not a whole like sponsored segment, even though the show is sponsored, but yeah, it's kind of cool with this whole natural like pro consensus piece. It's awesome.
And I think it's all about getting across value really, really succinctly. And whether you're doing that in a video or in a presentation, I came across these presentation principles. Sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but by a guy called Guy Kawasaki, who was one of the co-founders of Apple. And his presentation principles are 10, 20, 30. And what it's saying is you should have no more than 10 slides in a presentation. So this is assuming if you're doing a presentation rather than demoing a product, but no more than 10 slides, no more than 20 minutes, because that is the length of anyone's attention span without a lot of interactivity. And then the 30 is the words on your slide, the font, they've got to be no smaller than size 30. So rather than putting a lot of text on your slides, just have the key bullet points, because that's how you keep people's attention. That's how you keep it succinct. And I think one of the big challenges of that is delivering value so succinctly and with such brevity. And I, bringing that back to demo automation, I think that's one of the skills that we need to be able to do that, to be able to put the value of your solution into a 15-minute video. It's challenging, but the benefits of being able to do it effectively are enormous.
Agreed.
All right. Well, I think we've talked enough about consensus. If you guys want to check it out, go consensus.com/VDSEs or go directly to goconsensus.com. It is time to move on to the not so fire round. So these are the same 4 questions we ask almost every guest. We usually start off with Benny.
All right. So I think you've talked a little bit about it already throughout the show, but just ask it again. What do you love about pre-sale?
What do I love about pre-sales? For the big presentation, standing on a stage and challenging someone's way of thinking, solving problems, and doing it creatively. I think these are all the things that I love about pre-sales.
All right, second question. Other than automation, how would you change the pre-sales role?
Other than automation, how would I change the pre-sales role? Move away from demos, not entirely, but I've recently moved to a professional services company where they're all about consulting rather than pre-sales. And I heard someone say the other day that you don't need to demonstrate the software to be able to sell it. And it suddenly made me stop in my tracks and think about it, because I think if you can really deliver the value of the product and the case studies and industry best cases and scenarios and things like that, actually the product demo might become quite a small part of that. So I think with pre-sales moving more towards the world of value engineering, calculating return on investments is going to become really, really important for us. Obviously, there'll still be demos, but I think that kind of value selling approach will become really important.
Nice.
Yeah, that's interesting. It kind of like goes against that whole, which is a good thing. It goes against the whole like spray and pray mentality about demoing, which is like demo to everybody to see what sticks, as opposed to like, you know what, try to demo as infrequently as possible and just try to sell as much value and only demo when entirely necessary. It's kind of cool. Cool concept. All right, next question. So we've talked about some. We're going to have links to these all in our show notes. So it's really cool to come across your blog, the Modern SC, Solutions Consultant SC. So in addition to yours, what are some other books or tools or resources may you recommend to anybody that wants to further their game in pre-sales or just develop a little bit more professionally?
Well, I think one of the first books I ever read that was about pre-sales was John Kerr, Mastering Technical Sales. And I'm sure you're both aware of that, but it became an absolute Bible to me of, how to become a best-in-class solutions consultant, sort of living and breathing that book. I must have read it about 4 times because I come back to it just to check, right, am I doing this right? How can I reinterpret this to look at it in a slightly different way? How can I better myself? I I reckon that is probably the most important and the most formative book that I've read in my career. There is another good one. God, you put me on the spot here. It is called The Rules of Work. I think it is. I can't remember who it's by. But that's really, really good because it's been taken from a consultant who has kind of written down the kind of things which seem really, really obvious when you're later in your career about like even simple things like your dress code, the way that you speak at work, the way that you manage your time, the kind of things that might be really obvious to someone who's 10 years into their career, but for someone who's just starting out, they are so important because they're not blindingly obvious when you're just coming fresh out of school or out of university. So I read that honestly in the first few months of me getting my first graduate job, and that was a big, big help to me as well.
Richard Templar?
Richard Templar, that's the one.
Okay.
Rules of Work.
Nice. All right. So we got those two. And by the way, dress code is usually shorts and a wife beater. That works for me.
Wife beater is key, though.
What was that?
It to be ripped though, or stained.
No, it's white. I'm Lebanese. We can just wear white, and we're fine. All right. Last question of the day before this gets too awkward. What are you working on improving right now?
Myself. Right now, it's myself.
All of you?
All of it. So no, I recently joined a new company, actually moving away from, because previously I was working in pre-sales at a vendor, whereas now I'm working at a professional services company, and everything works very, very differently, and it's an enormous firm. So for me, what I'm working on is my internal network. Who do I need to be able to speak to help solve the right problems? How does the organization work as a whole? And I think all of these, for anyone who changes jobs, moves into a new role, I think these things are really important. So that's my focus for the short term.
All right. Well, that sounds very good. And this has been an amazing conversation. And I feel people should learn more about you and listen to you more. You've been on other podcasts as well, including Two Peas in a Pod and Pre-Sales Collective, I believe. So if people want to reach out and talk to you and learn more about you, where can they do that?
Either through the contact form on my website, so that's themodernsc.com, or through my LinkedIn. My name is Thomas Edwards, always open for a chat or a call, anything about pre-sales. I'm fascinated about how pre-sales just works in all of these different organizations. And I think we've got such a strong community now from like podcasts like these, through so many resources on the internet. We can only build on it.
It's the best community in the world.
Exactly.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, Tom, for coming on. I love talking to Tom.
Just in general, or
I love talking to sales, and here's, if you've ever been invited to the show, or you're ever going to be invited to this show at some point in the future, there is almost zero prep, right? Because you, Benny, and I, I'd love to sync up with you more, but we barely see each other, and we kind of have to schedule minutes here and there to actually talk. And with our guests as well, and I've been on podcasts where it's scripted, and I did not enjoy it, mainly for the experience of there is no follow-up. I don't want to talk for a half hour, but I hope that the host would follow up with me on something that I've said. So just having it unscripted with Tom allowed him to go into different places than he maybe originally thought. I just enjoy that. So if you're ever on the podcast, you're invited and you ask what is there to prepare, not much. Maybe 5 minutes to come up with a couple of topics, and then we'll go from there. But yeah, I just love talking to Tom in general. And I just love the way he thinks about the profession of sales engineering and pre-sales solution consultant, whatever you want to call it.
Agree. Yeah, 100% agree. Goodness, yeah, there's so many cool things. Like, don't get me wrong, speaking to all the different guests on the show have all been really, really cool. It's great experience for me, and really insightful for a whole bunch of different reasons as well. But I will say with Tom, it was, I don't know if special was the right word, but I don't think it was very often that I've had the opportunity to speak to SEs that were in my own graduating class. Like, not we didn't go to school or anything together, but we both like graduated university at the same time, and then like went into the workforce around the same time as well. And so it was kind of cool for me personally just to be able to see like a parallel route of an SE, I guess, out of school into the position that he's in now. And yeah, and obviously like the way that he kind of saw a solutions engineer, so rather saw somebody up on a stage one time and kind of loved everything about that, and then kind of worked his way to becoming that, was a really cool path. And I think I also related to that idea of, you know, seeing somebody that had that level of prestige and, you know, wanting to be able to be that person. Yeah, I don't know. I think that was a cool motivation and just a really cool conversation and all the different routes that it went.
One thing I like about that is he basically didn't let life happen to him. He kind of took charge of where he wanted to go. And the same thing when he jumped into sales engineering or solution consulting. My apologies for my solution consultant friends out there, including you, Benny, where, you know, he didn't just sit by and be passive about it. Right? So I really enjoy that. So for the folks listening, follow the Modern SE. There's going to be a link in the show notes. This is show 161. If you haven't left a rating or review, please do so. We say it almost every week. I get tired of saying it. If you are trying to break into the sales engineering role, or you're trying to move jobs within the sales engineering role itself, check out the Road to Sales Engineering. It's a course specifically created to help those looking to move to a different role, specifically into sales engineering. Right. That was the best pitch ever.
That was a good pitch. I mean, yeah, not a bad pitch by any means. And like, I mean, just to like piggyback on top of that, the value to the sales engineering course, the Road to Sales Engineering course, for especially somebody that hasn't really been there before. And I think most people that haven't been SEs that want to move into that role, oh, this is going to sound really stupid. I was going to say most people that haven't been in that role that want to be SEs just haven't been SEs. They really don't know what to expect from the role.
Okay, and you're just making it worse. How about we just...
Well, I'll just
go ahead.
Having like the experience that you bring, the experience that all the different guests have brought onto the show as well as all the private chats that you've had, to be able to take all those perspectives and then kind of consolidate that all into a single course for you to be able, like you, not you, Ramsey, but you know, a prospective SE to be able to kind of gain from and take that into their prospective SE role is super invaluable. And it's something that I wish I had when I had first started, but you know, you'll be able to accelerate your career probably by a couple of years just by taking that course alone. So definitely.
Thanks, Benny.
Welcome.
Thanks, Benny. Your check is in the mail.
Yes. All right. No, but it's true. It really is true.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Benny. Thanks, Tom, for coming on. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate you being here and choosing to spend your time like that. I know time is an investment, especially these days. So I appreciate it. With that, and Pitchy Benny signing off.